Every single adaptation in the web of life can change the entire destiny of a species. Today, a friend of mine will explain it to you.
When we hear the name Charles Darwin, we usually picture this serene, white-bearded sage, right? Just calmly rewriting the rules of life from a dusty study. But, actually, scratch that image. Beneath that tranquil surface is a flat-out, dark psychological thriller. In this explainer, we're diving straight into his private diaries to uncover a secret so absolutely terrifying it literally broke his body and fractured his home for 2 whole decades. We're going to look at the incredibly heavy, agonizing cost of just one single world-shattering idea. Now, I want you to really think about this quote for a second. It is like confessing a murder. This isn't the confession of some violent criminal on the run. No, this is a terrified naturalist trying to describe the crushing weight of his own discovery. Back in 1844, Darwin admitted to a close friend that species change. And we have to remember, in Victorian England, suggesting that life evolved without some sort of divine intervention, that wasn't just controversial, it was straight-up intellectual treason. Darwin knew exactly what he was sitting on. He knew for a fact it would upend society, completely enrage the church, and destroy the comforting creation myth of his era. To him, letting this theory out into the world felt like committing a brutal, unforgivable crime.
But this agonizing realization actually started years earlier, on what we could call the dangerous page. Picture this. It's 1837, and a young Darwin opens a secret notebook, scribbles just 2 words, "I think," and draws this really crude little evolutionary tree. And right then, in that singular moment, a truly terrifying reality took hold. He realized there was no grand, comforting master plan. There was only ruthless survival, extinction, and continuous change.
So, what does this actually mean for him? Well, this simple mechanism, natural selection, completely dismantled creationism. It basically replaced a benevolent creator with blind, brutal mechanics. Darwin knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that this idea would invite the wrath of the church and absolutely destroy his reputation among his scientific peers. He was sitting on a heresy that would upend everything they knew. And the sheer terror of that fact, it just started to eat him alive. And the thing is, the psychological weight of this heresy didn't just stay in his head. It literally broke his body. Darwin kept a diary of health for 6 years in his 40s, and the symptoms he recorded are just brutal. He lived violently ill. We're talking being plagued by intense vertigo, severe vomiting, and a constantly racing heart. He endured daily panic attacks with this overwhelming sensation of impending death. His gut was literally twisting under the anxiety of the secret he was keeping hidden away at Downhouse.
But the torment wasn't just professional, The true tragedy was unfolding right inside his own home. And here is where we see this heartbreaking divide. Charles was obsessively pursuing these biological mechanisms that dismantled creation, while his beloved wife Emma held this incredibly devout Unitarian faith. She believed firmly in the utility of prayer, she believed in an afterlife, and the doctrines of her church. And they were profoundly in love, which just makes this ideological chasm absolute emotional torture for both of them.
There was this specific gospel scripture that absolutely terrified Emma. She lived with this constant haunting fear that her husband's lack of faith and this heretical work he was doing meant they would be separated forever in the afterlife. She constantly prayed for his soul. And Charles, well, knowing his discoveries brought the woman he loved such immense spiritual pain absolutely devastated him. Just imagine the dynamic here. He's quietly writing the book that essentially dismantles God's design, while the woman he loves most in the world is praying to God to save him.
So just imagine living with that immense domestic pressure, on top of a failing body and the looming threat of total social ruin. It naturally leads us to one of the most famous puzzles in scientific history. Why on earth did Darwin wait 2 entire decades to publish his masterpiece? Seriously, what was he actually doing during those 20 years of agonizing silence?
Now, for years, this popular myth has framed Darwin's 20-year delay entirely as this cowardly exile. The story usually goes that he buried his manuscript out of pure paranoia, just trembling in his study, totally paralyzed by the fear of being branded a heretic by the Victorian Church and shunned by society. But while the fear was very, very real, the idea that he simply hid from it, that's a total distortion. Actually, researchers at Cambridge University have revealed that his fear drove a totally different response. It drove meticulous, obsessive preparation. When you map out the reality of his delay, you see he wasn't just hiding away in the dark. He actually spent 8 grueling years studying barnacles of all things. And why? To establish himself as an unimpeachable biological expert.
He was basically building an impenetrable fortress of evidence. So his slow pace wasn't cowardice at all. It was his profound paranoia channeling itself into making his theory absolutely bulletproof. To put that into perspective, think about the number 10. Over those 20 years, right in the middle of his daily panic attacks and vomiting, his work ethic was absolutely relentless. He published more than 10 other scientific books. 10. He knew perfectly well that the man dropping the ultimate biological bombshell couldn't be some amateur theorist. He had to become the most respected naturalist of his generation, and he worked himself half to death to get there.
And it's so important to note that Emma wasn't just a fearful bystander in all of this. She was his harshest critic and his completely devoted nurse. There was this incredible contingency plan they made in 1844. Charles actually drafted his initial essay on species and had Emma review the pages. She would literally leave thoughtful critiques right there in the margins. Then he wrote a solemn memo, leaving funds and explicitly asking Emma to publish his theory if his mysterious illness ended up killing him. He trusted the deeply religious woman who feared for his soul to be the executor of the very heresies she dreaded. It's just a wild dynamic.
But as it turns out, history wouldn't let him wait for death. In 1858, a young naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace sent Darwin a letter, and Darwin's blood must have just run cold. Wallace had independently discovered the exact same theory of natural selection. The thunder was completely stolen. So, forced out of the shadows, a horrified Darwin finally published On the Origin of Species a year later. And it shattered the world forever, exactly like he feared it would, while he himself retreated even further into the shadows of Downhouse.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, it becomes clear that Darwin's legacy isn't just about finches or fossils. It is a profoundly tragic human drama. When you really sit down and consider his decades of sickness, his trembling hands, and his wife's tearful prayers, you have to ask yourself a piercing question. What is the true cost of discovering a truth that shatters your world, breaks your body, and threatens the soul of the person you love most? Just think about that the next time you hear the words natural selection.